We are going to start with the State of the Union that President Trump gave last week, which was the longest in American history at 1 hour and 47 minutes, beating President Clinton's record in 2000. In the State of the Union address, his theme was America at 250, strong, prosperous, and united. And he said the state of our union is strong. So I'll provide a few brief highlights and then my thoughts on the elections coming around the corner. Overall, Trump remained on message during the State of the Union, and this will be almost certainly his final State of the Union and the last of any kind of joint session of Congress with a Republican majority. Next year, all political observers expect to see Hakeem Jeffries, who right now is the House Minority Leader, to sit behind President Trump, where Mike Johnson was sitting as the Speaker of the House. Anyway, that is for the future. In the here and now, it was a very Trumpian speech. As I said, he stayed on message, he stayed on script. Republicans were probably very relieved, only jumping off topic to take a few jabs at Democrats. However, as there will be a theme, he ignored a lot of issues that Americans have, in particular with concerns about economics. He focused a lot on foreign policy, saying with Iran in particular, we are in negotiations with them. They want to make a deal, but we haven't heard those secret words. We will never have a nuclear weapon. He talked about his immigration record, which is unpopular with many Americans, and he had several horror stories that I think were justified in order to underscore his point, such as a young girl who had been crashed into by an illegal alien driver who got a driver's license in a blue state. He gave medals to the USA hockey team who beat the Canadians at their own sport, and that got a rare bipartisan applause. He also lamented he couldn't give the medal to himself, which I thought was quite amusing. And the stories were important, but Trump spent little time on affordability. He blamed Biden and the Democrats for the affordability crisis, which they do have some blame for, but offered little to no solutions to fix it other than showcasing his tax cuts, which were never affordable to the U.S. Treasury. What voters really seem to want, and will never happen, is for prices to come back down. A lot of people don't understand that inflation is simply prices going up. Prices going down is deflation. And deflation in certain food categories is a good thing, or certain categories to begin with is a good thing, and it's okay in many cases. But as a whole, prices going down is a bad sign for the economy for long reasons we cannot explain here. Overall, the State of the Union address was what I expected. Trump touted immigration, foreign policy, tax cuts, which are his strongest points, and took jabs at Democrats for inflation under Biden. And after the address, Virginia Governor Abigail Spanberger delivered the response. This is usually done by the opposition party to call out the president's failures. The president is required from time to time to give Congress information on the State of the Union according to Article 2, Section 3, Clause 1 of the U.S. Constitution. So the State of the Union is at least partly constitutional and the other part is political, while the response to the State of the Union is completely political. So meanwhile, dozens of Democrats across the country had their own counter-programming events, one which was on the National Mall, and I think that was mostly just a temper tantrum. Spanberger's address, which was about 13 minutes long, was focused on the cost of living, and she said that, is the president working to make life affordable for you and your family? Is the president working to keep Americans safe at home and abroad? Is the president working for you? And a spoiler alert, for the most part, the answer is no. There's very little President Trump has done to lower prices for Americans. He announced a few things like banning companies from buying homes, which, as I explained before, is not going to change that much because they don't own that many homes to begin with compared to the whole market. Trump announced Trump RX, and Spanberger, of course, pointed to the tariffs. She said that there was ice in American streets. He escalating tensions with foreign powers, which became increasingly relevant because we ended up attacking Iran about a couple of days later. It really shows how Democrats will run the coming midterm elections in the years ahead. And I think this is truly revealing because if you remember back to 2022 under Joe Biden, affordability was one of the top issues of concerns and Republicans did not run on it. They were running on cultural issues instead, which was actually their weak point because abortion was the issue. 65% of Democrats were concerned about affordability back then, and 92% of Republicans were then as well. 79% of all registered voters in October of 2022 were concerned about affordability. Yet Republicans did not capture that, and they underperformed that year. So Democrats are not making the same mistake, and that is one of the reasons they will likely win this year. This comes at a time when President Trump's approval rating is at record lows for his second term. We're only a few points higher than we were in the weeks after January 6, 2021, which was considered the rock bottom for Trump. That was as low as it could go. And according to CNN, Trump's approval rating is minus 27, which is staggeringly low. And his approval would be at 36%, and his disapproval at 63%. If I were a Republican, I would be primarily concerned about Hispanic voters because many of them voted for Trump in 2024. His approval among them is minus 55. And in his own party, it is plus 64, which is actually quite low. 82% of Republicans approve and 18% disapprove. Generally, when we sink into the 70s, that's where problems begin to arise. So we're not quite there yet, but there's no reason to think we won't be there. If we get there, which I believe we will, then I would expect a primary challenger to J.D. Vance in 2028. And among all age demographics, the president is doing very badly. His best support is among boomers, but that is still minus 7. He is doing particularly badly with educated people and women, and more than 30 points underwater. Kamala Harris did better with them anyway, so it was already quite a low baseline. So I wouldn't write this off as a one-off or as a trend because CNN is a good pollster, CNN/SSRS, which is who conducts the poll. And as for independents, that's the group I always pay attention to the most. His approval is minus 47, which is staggering. Only 23% of independents approve of Trump's job. And it goes without saying, his approval among Democrats is minus 90, so that's no surprise there. And also, I think in that same poll, one of the most revealing issues was the top issue among Democrats is affordability and the cost of living. Foreign policy, where Trump is focused, is only a top issue for 2% of voters. So it shows that Trump is out of lockstep with American voters. Voters might approve of what he's doing abroad, but that's not a concern. That's not their top concern, which would mean that those voters are likely not to support Republicans in the coming midterms. Speaking of the midterms, Republicans this year will probably try to run a base campaign. That is what I'm thinking. That's what they're going to do. They're not going to spend a lot of time trying to win over swing voters. Winning them over is not going to work. I think Democrats will run a more centrist campaign. They will position themselves on the center left as opposed to the left, while Republicans are going to position themselves more on the right. That's what I believe. This could mean the Senate would actually flip. And I was looking back into history a little bit, and President Bush's job approval in March of 2006 was at 37% according to Gallup. So we might be in 2006 territory. And why do I bring up 2006? Because that year, Democrats didn't expect to win the Senate, but they did. They gained 5 seats, picking up Montana, Missouri, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. So they swept every swing state, and Ohio and Virginia were swing states back then. They held on to their incumbents, and they gained 2 red states, and they almost flipped the state of Tennessee. So what would that look like today, 20 years later? Well, first, before we go on, know that it is more polarized. The environment is more polarized now than it was 20 years ago. Senators 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, used to win huge victories. For example, Olympia Snowe, she was a Republican from Maine. She got over 70% of the vote in a state that was a more blue-leaning state. So don't expect weird states to flip. However, Democrats need to hold on to all of their current seats, which would be in Michigan, Minnesota, Georgia, New Hampshire. So that they need to hold on to all of them, which I believe they will. Democrats will likely pick up North Carolina, so if they need 4, that's 1 down. Then Maine I'm skeptical of for reasons we don't have time to get into. But if we give that to the Democrats as well, then they would need 2 more. So that's up to 49 seats. Where are the other 2? Well, if they gain 2 red seats like in 2006, that would be enough to do it. Alaska is a close one. Texas, we'll have to wait and see. We'll find out this week, actually, who some of the nominees are, or at least one of them, hopefully. And that would be a big deal for reasons I've explained before. So I expect between 49 and 50 seats for Democrats. I'm thinking 50 more at this point, which would mean that J.D. Vance would be the tie-breaking vice president. So, and keep this in mind. If he's running for president, he won't have time to break ties in the Senate because he's going to be all over the country campaigning in states like Iowa and South Carolina, Nevada, New Hampshire. He's going to be all over the country. He's going to be nowhere near Washington, D.C. And Ohio remains a possibility, but it is a long shot. I would put that as likely Republican. I really don't think Democrats are going to win that one back. It would take their candidate is okay, but not great. Democrats are going to have to defend it again in 2 years anyway because it's a special election. It's not a full 6-year term. So I think pouring money there is actually not worth their time. I think they'd be better off in North Carolina, Maine, Alaska, and Texas. So that is my monthly midterm update. I said I'll do it once a month, and there's no change to the House. I think that's pretty much foregone. I don't see how Republicans could hold on to that, barring major electoral changes. We are still 6 months and a few days out, but I don't think that's going to change. So then we're going to move to Iran. President Trump decided to blow up my schedule, no pun intended, again, and we're going to keep this brief because we still don't know very much. It only happened yesterday, and I'm recording this on Sunday. You're hearing this on Monday, so you will know more than I do. So I'm not going to make too much of an opinion, but I will say that the supreme leader of Iran, we do know that he has been killed. I don't even know how to pronounce his name, so I'm not even going to bother. But we do know that he was a leader of a country that has been a state sponsor of terrorism in places like Syria, in Yemen, and even in Afghanistan and other places. So it is good that he is gone. Who is coming? Nobody knows, or at least I don't know yet. Maybe you do. Nobody knows. They're entering a 40-day mourning period, so they might not announce a new leader until that is over. If this is like Maduro in and out, then that would be a good thing. I don't think it's going to be like that because we didn't want regime change in Venezuela. They just went to the next person. In Iran, we're going to want regime change, and that's what the president has called for. And if we do get regime change, then how is that going to look? If they just move to the next person, are we going to kill them too until we go all the way down the line? How long are they going to drag this out? Who knows? And we could get into one of the problems here is my big concern is the price of oil and therefore gas. 15 to 20 million barrels of oil pass through the Strait of Hormuz, which is right by Iran, and it's not a very wide strip. The narrowest point is not very wide at all. So that is 15 to 20 million barrels is way more than the U.S. alone produces. We produce about 13 million, so you think 13 is way less than 15 to 20. And if all of that is cut off, which is unlikely, but if it is cut off because Iran is currently blocking it, and they would do that to cause an energy crisis, and even if they weren't, it would still not be safe to go through that because of the missiles that are flying overhead. So oil prices are about $70 a barrel, which is quite low. It's not super low, but it's low. And it could spike to over 100, that is the theory, which would mean we would be returning to 2022 era price levels. And that would mean $4 gas in nearly every region of the country. And this would be a disaster for Republicans. Great news for Democrats. OPEC increased production. They increased production by a measly like 209,000 barrels. So that is a drop in the bucket, no pun intended, compared to the 15 to 20 million that could be cut off. So that will help a little bit. If Saudi Arabia increased their production, that could help. But once again, 15 to 20 million is going to be a huge problem if that gets cut off. And if prices go up, then that is going to cause inflation and probably a recession here at home because 2022 was a very low growth year. And we were thinking we still had a lot of COVID stimulus back then. Now we have zero. And that could cause a big problem. It's too early to say. And so one more thing I want you to understand is oil prices are set on a global market. So you will often hear, after everything I've always said, people might even go in the comments and they might say, well, this is why we need to produce more oil production, blah, 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 blah. Except that is not the case here. In fact, it is a reason that we should move toward green energy more. And I'm not a huge I'm not saying climate change doesn't exist. I'm just saying that I think it's way overblown, and I think the data has proved that over the years because the predictions, each single one has been wrong for so many years. So I'm not a climate change denier. I'm more of a climate change isn't as big of a deal as everyone makes it out to be kind of person. So and even me, I'm saying this is a reason to move more toward green energy, which this administration obviously does not want to do. So even if we did pump more oil, even if we started tomorrow, we started pumping another 10 million barrels of oil a day, oil prices would still go up because oil prices are set on a global market. They're not set based on what's here at home. We can't just wall ourselves in and we can't just use the oil that we make here, even though we export more than we import. It's not doable for lots of different reasons that we can't get into now. And besides, we do not have a nationalized oil industry in this country, which is a good thing because if Joe Biden was in office and we had a nationalized oil industry, we know he would have ordered them to stop drilling because that's what he tried to do with executive orders. So we don't have a nationalized oil industry. So even if Trump told the oil executives, which he did do it, by the way, pump more oil, they are not going to listen. And they don't have to listen. And they are not going to do it because oil prices They were too low, and I don't know what they are going to be now because the markets haven't opened yet. But even if they do rise, they're probably not going to start pumping oil again because they don't want to start pumping right as oil prices are coming back down. It would make no sense. So I think the funny thing is that Democrats, if you think about it privately, they're probably very pleased with what's going on here. Publicly, they're not because they're calling this executive overreach, which is a story for another time. But if this causes a recession and higher inflation, they're probably going to win the Senate. That would be my prediction. This would be a landslide victory, and they would probably be quite happy about this, assuming this carries on until we get to the November elections. And if we got that far, if we did get to $100 oil, we would have $4 gas this summer. Gas on election day would probably be about $3.50 a gallon. It would be quite high, and that would be really bad. I mean, if you think about it, Biden's approval rating, it sunk. Its low was July 2022, is about 37%, and we're already that low, so we would drop even lower. I would think we'd probably get into the low 30s. That's how bad it would be. So I also, before we move on, I want to, speaking of our president, let's listen to him back in 2011 and see what he has to say about this.
Our president will start a war with Iran because he has absolutely no ability to negotiate. He's weak and he's ineffective.
So moving back to Capitol Hill, a Republican congressman has gotten into a scandal, and this is unfortunately really horrible. If you have any kids that are around, I highly recommend that you shoo them away or you pause and come back later. It came out about 2 weeks ago that in 2024 he had an affair with a political aide, and there were text messages in April of last year. She worked on his campaign, and once the affair became an open secret, they treated her as a black sheep. You think they would treat him as a black sheep, but they treated her as a black sheep. She committed suicide, unfortunately, by burning herself alive. Where the congressman comes in is that he asked her for a sexy pic and asked her about her favorite sexual positions. And this man is a Republican. His name is Tony Gonzalez. He has a wife and several children, which makes it even worse. Several Republicans have called on him to resign. However, Speaker Johnson has not, and the reason he has not done that is because his majority is already really thin. It is 218 to 214, so he can't afford to lose another one. And then there's another Republican who is in his 70s. He is reportedly terminally ill. He wants to resign, but Speaker Johnson is begging him not to, so that could be 2 more resignations. And by the time it would get filled, it probably wouldn't be until July or August that these seats would be filled at the earliest, which would mean that for the rest of the spring session, Republicans would be down 2 more seats, if that did happen. So it seems like neither are going to resign. Tony Gonzalez, he has refused to. He's saying there will be an opportunity for all the details and facts to come out. What you have seen is not the facts. Now, seems like that's just, it's politics. He has an election coming up, a primary coming up in 2 days, or 2 or 3 days. So if he loses the primary, he might just quit. If he wins, then I expect him to stay in office for the foreseeable future. So I don't think they're going to force him out. If he loses his primary, he might stick around. He might resign, as I said. If he wins, the Republicans are going to move on. If voters still vote for him, then they're basically approving everything that's going on. And lastly, this stuff came out like right before the primary, which is very suspicious, and I think is very convenient. Somebody maybe has some blackmail on him. I don't know. I'm not saying there's any wrongdoing on the part of the San Antonio Express News who released this, or that he's innocent, or that we should all let it go. But the timing is definitely interesting. So let's move over to Europe. This is going to be a longer episode because Trump decided to bomb another country. Let's move over to Europe. Ukraine watchers, you out there, got some bad news for you. On the anniversary of the invasion last week, the EU failed to provide a $90 billion euro loan, which would be about 110 billion. It was a 90 billion euro loan. It would have been about 110 billion. Remember, there has been no Ukraine aid from the United States since President Trump came into office. The last one was approved under Joe Biden. The loan was agreed to in principle back in December, but 2 countries have vetoed it. That would be Hungary and Slovakia, and they have cut off diesel, fuel, and emergency power to Ukraine. You might wonder, why did they do this? Well, it's because there was a pipeline that runs from Russia through Belarus, Ukraine, and into the Slovakia and Hungary that provides oil, and it was attacked in January, and that was about 6 weeks ago, and Ukraine has not rebuilt it. So you might be wondering, well, why didn't they rebuild it? We'll get to that in a moment. But Hungary and Slovakia are claiming that they're being extorted. And instead of Hungary and Slovakia for blaming Russia for impaling their economies, they're blaming Ukraine for not fixing the pipeline. However, even if Ukraine did fix the pipeline, they would probably get blown up again. So there really is no point in fixing the pipeline. And this is what happens when you rely on foreign adversaries for your energy needs. This is something Trump warned about 10 years ago, and here we are. So I have very little sympathy for Slovakia and Hungary on this one. They deserved it. And Ukraine has been pounding Russian the oil industry, pumping stations and refineries and oil extractions for the last 2 or 3 years. So the capacity of Russia's oil industry is already quite diminished compared to the beginning of the war. So focusing more on Ukraine here, except for the IMF, who provided an $8 billion loan to the country, Ukraine is not really getting any support. It's not getting support from us or from the EU. Ukraine is facing a budget crisis in April, and the World Bank estimates it will take $588 billion to rebuild the country. And I think that is way too low. It's going to be at least $1 or $2 trillion to rebuild Ukraine. And before it's all said and done, I don't really want to focus on that too much. Instead, I want to focus on the elections that are in Hungary later this year. If you listen to my elections video, I make one at the end of each year. I made one about 3 months ago. And if you listen to that, or 2 months ago, and if you listen to that, you will know Hungary has an election, and you know that the opposition is ahead. The election's only a month away now, and they are ahead by a decent amount. Viktor Orban is the prime minister of Hungary. He's been in office for 16 years. If Peter Memoir wins, which he probably will, then he will probably take a more pro-EU stance, and considering Orban has been a huge block on the EU providing aid to Hungary or Ukraine, then this could be a big game changer. And also, since Trump has come to power, there has been an anti-right-wing backlash all over the world. So I would not be surprised if we see something happen again here in Hungary. So we'll have to see more of that as the election comes up. I expect relations between Hungary and Europe to get worse as we approach the election, because Orban is going to play politics and he's going to make it worse and worse. There's a great video by TLDR News. If you're interested, it is in the description down below if you want a better summary than what I can provide. So overall, as it was 4 years ago, the race between Russia's economy collapsing and the political will of Europe and the Americas to support Ukraine is still ongoing. I know people have been saying the Russian economy will collapse for years and years and years. I do believe it will collapse eventually. I'm not going to say when, because people have done that for years and they've been wrong each time. How do we know this, though? Russia's main economic engine is their oil industry, and as I said, it's been pounded over the years. The oil has lost a lot of its profitability because oil prices are so low, and remember, they're selling at a discount, which means they're actually selling it for even lower. And inflation and interest rates in Russia are very high. Inflation not so much, but interest rates are like north of 20%. So companies can't just borrow money to stay afloat like they could before. That's not going to work. The only good thing going for them is that their debt to GDP ratio is super duper low. It's 20%. So if they do have access to credit, which is, there's really not that much credit available, they could go a long way borrowing before they run out of money. However, interest rates are very high, which means that government borrowing is very expensive. So we could only be a couple years away from collapse. We could be a lot longer. Who knows? World War I was a war of attrition. This is a very similar kind of war where territory was not really gained or lost toward the last few years of the war. Usually things move very, very slowly until they move quickly. So I don't think negotiations are ever going to go anywhere, and I think that is really just for show, for political purposes. And if you think about it this way, Russia's big war, Putin loves to talk about World War II. World War II for Russia began in June of 1941. Obviously, for Germany and France and Britain and China, it began years before then. But it began in June 1941, and it ended in May of 1945. And then there was Japan a couple months later. That was about 4 years. It was 3 years and 11 months. It's now been over 4 years of the Ukraine war, so this war is even longer. So one thing I do want to mention, I didn't mention this earlier, was a lot of Russia's economy is the government spending is being produced for military equipment, and then that military equipment is being blown up in Ukraine. So it's not very productive. It would be like me taking spending money to run my printer and then taking the paper and burning it. So it doesn't really produce anything good. And if you borrow money to make that happen, then you're not really. The idea is when you borrow money, you borrow to invest. So you're taking that money, you're investing it in things that will produce you money in the end. If you're borrowing the money and then burning it, then you're not actually producing anything. You're making it harder for you to pay it off in the future. At the same time, so as long as oil prices stay low, which as I mentioned earlier with Iran, if oil prices go up, that could be a problem for, it could help fund Russia's war machine. This is where the international things always overlap, so that's how this is going. So let's hope it's a short-lived boost for Ukraine's sake and for our sake here at home. Shifting to Ukraine, Ukraine's economy is weak as well, which is obviously no surprise because their country is being blown to bits. The growth is actually not too bad. It's about 2% this year. That's the estimate. Inflation is 6%. It's 6% in Russia as well. And I say only 6% because war usually produces very high inflation. After the war, World War II here in America, we had 20% inflation briefly. So war is always inflationary because governments spend lots of money and supply chains get cut. So you have more demand and less supply, which leads to higher prices. War is almost always inflationary. So, considering both countries are at war, I would have expected double-digit inflation by this point. To me, I'm not an economic genius, but it would just suggest to me that both countries still have a long way to go before they would get to where they would be facing economic collapse. So I think my assessment is that Ukraine will collapse first. I'm not saying I want that to happen or that it should happen or that it absolutely will happen, but I think Russia still has a long way to go before we get there. The longer this war goes on for Ukraine, I think that is better for them because they could burn down Russia's support, but it also makes it worse because it will be harder to rebuild when this is all said and done. Once Russia starts turning on the money printer, that is probably when we will know the end is nigh, and we are not anywhere close to that. All right, so I was going to talk about the government shutdown, but we have been going almost 30 minutes already, so I think that is good enough for this episode. Not much has changed on the government shutdown. Hopefully it ends soon so that these people can get paid. So we'll have to talk about that next episode. That is all we have here. Thank you for tuning in as always. Make sure you like and subscribe. We don't have that many subscribers, but we get a decent amount of views. So please like and subscribe, and hope to see you next week. And as always, please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Bye-bye.